I'm here with my good friend Austin Mullins, who happens to be the number two ranked mentor in the world on Growth Mentor, not just in his specialty, which is SEO, but just overall in the entire world among all people on that platform, and not just marketers, but everybody on that platform. And I'm on that platform, but only because he invited me. And we're here to talk about mastery. And so I'm really happy to have him as my first guest on this yet to be named podcast. If you guys have a name in mind, let me know, because I haven't come up with one that I love yet, but it's all about mastery. So with that in mind, Austin, welcome.
Thank
And
you.
what is your definition of mastery?
This may be somewhat underwhelming, but I basically just view it as the continuous process of improvement in a particular area of skill. I don't. I, you may share this belief, you may not, but I don't think you kind of arrive at mastery. I think mastery is the pursuit or the journey. Um, and you hear people that at least outsiders would deem masters of their craft, and they often kind of think of themselves still very much as students. And so I kind of adopt a similar view where I don't expect to arrive at any point.
That's how I think of it too. There's no particular destination. Because if there was, then somebody who's a master would just stop. I mean, they would be able to maintain, but they wouldn't be able to go any past where they already are.
Yeah. And I think also, like, to me, part of the call of, like, or the measure of people that, like, achieve true mastery is when they're able to then push the field or the subject matter even further forward. That's maybe like a true master or a standout, but not all of us will get to that point in every area, right? You could be merely very competent and better than 98% of the population at something and still not be able to drive that area of expertise forward with any new contributions. But if you can, that's a special mark right there.
Absolutely. And so, with that in mind, what is something you like to talk about that you've been working on mastering in your career?
I mean, within a professional context, there are a lot of things that I've been trying to master for a very long time. So, I mostly do content marketing, and most of that is very search engine optimization oriented. So, there's a lot of subtopics within that, just like media production, both written and visual, um, even like on the web, right? Like building web interfaces, building websites. You've got the kind of whole sales and persuasion front, which took me a long time to get the hang of. I also do a lot of coaching and mentoring, like you referenced. So there's the presentation skills, which happens in day to day work. Got to get buy in from executives on new marketing campaigns, but then also you got to be able to teach. And so that's a thing that I've been working on honing for a long time. You have the link building side, you have the technical SEO side, so kind of like hard skills that go into what I'm doing as well. So there's all that. All that's kind of within the realm of work. And then in my personal life, of course, I have things that I'm trying to master as well. I've tried to get great at making cocktails and cooking nice dishes. I try to get better at playing guitar over time, something I started when I was a kid and have never taken seriously enough, but nonetheless try to slowly improve.
And I want to talk about all of that. Um, First, you mentioned SEO. So, let's start there. What actually is SEO? Are you building search engines, or what is it? Hmm.
That would be interesting. No, it is not building search engines. So for anyone brand new to it, it stands for search engine optimization. But it's basically the process of trying to influence what shows up in search results in Google or Bing or Yahoo, any of the major search engines. So trying to understand what factors are they looking for, and then reverse engineer such that we can build brands that are going to compete well in that space. So we're going to try to match whatever signals they're looking for in terms of content quality and topical authority of the publication, and hitting on all the technical things you need to hit on such that the website is fast, accessible, mobile responsive, all these things we kind of value on the modern web. And then by doing that, be able to show up higher in search, bring more people into the site, give them a great content experience, and those that want to take that further and make a purchasing decision, then have our client companies or whichever project we're working on be amongst the consideration set of options they look at to solve some particular challenge, whether that's driving into software, consulting, or a physical product, or what have you.
So in a nutshell, you're looking to help pages get ranked in the search engines. People want to be on page one of the search results.
That's a big part of it, and then the delivering on that promise, right? Because if we just get people to the website and then they have a horrible time, Google's going to notice those signals of user behavior that we didn't satisfy what they wanted, right? They come back to the search results, they click on something else, they go somewhere else. Not a good sign. And also, in order for us to be able to monetize any of that traffic and actually persuade someone to trust us and do business with us, we've got to deliver a good experience, whether, give them whatever they came there for, whether that's education or a resource they wanted to access, or some sort of data that they didn't have that we kind of promised in our headline, and being even competing in that space.
So before we even dive into how you're going about mastering all of that, because that sounds complex, how did you first get interested in SEO, search engine optimization?
That's a good question. It was kind of a winding journey, where me ending up in content, content marketing more broadly, and SEO makes sense looking backwards, but wasn't a thing that even occurred to me when I was younger. So I first started my professional career in kind of the white collar space, doing copywriting when I was actually still in high school and immediately after, which was pretty early. I remember when Upwork was still called Odesk, and doing really, really crappy copywriting jobs, frankly. But, I had no professional experience to speak of, and I take what I could get. I needed to build a portfolio, build some trust, get some reviews. So I started to work my way up that chain. I always had a kind of a natural knack for writing and communicating via the written word. So that was an easy kind of entrance to me into the world of marketing. And then I dabbled around for a bit. I even tried PPC, which you are far better at than I am. Found I was pretty mediocre at that. Quickly came back to kind of the organic side. And then as I got a little older, I for a while was able to just support myself as a copywriter full time. But ended up realizing I wasn't very good at sales. So I cold email and pitched my way into a sales gig at an outreach agency, which did a lot of cold email outreach for actually agencies, so marketing, design, development agencies. And that was a real trial by fire. I learned to get good at sales, much better at kind of persuasive copy and presentations, and learning how business actually worked at a kind of a more fundamental level, getting to talk to a lot of founders and co-founders of these service-based businesses. While I was there, started a link building agency on the side, learned link building, which is a key component of SEO, from Dan Ray, who's a good link builder in the space, and launched kind of a side business around doing that. And then eventually jumped ship from the sales gig. I was in charge of sales there by this point, and left to go kind of all in on the link building agency. And since I had content experience from the past, layered that in, and then kind of taught myself the technical side over time. And eventually that's how you get to being a full-fledged SEO agency. That you learn strategy, you learn technical, you learn link building, you learn content production. And if you can tie all that together and build a machine that can do that on a regular basis, you can get some good rankings, get good results, have happy clients. So that's more or less the journey. And then at some point, the link building agency got rebranded and all that, but that became the current business.
Wow, that's quite a journey. You mentioned that writing was how you got started on that journey, and you said copywriting. For people that don't know, what are the differences between normal writing and copywriting?
Yeah, so I really would think of copywriting as having two different camps. So we'll get to that in a moment. But the general difference is, most of us grew up with this kind of academic frame of writing, where it's very structured and you introduce things in a certain way. And I would find copywriting really is more persuasion or education oriented and less formal. You're not trying to write to a certain standard as much. I mean, the standard is dictated by the brand you build, but you can kind of set your own standards. So some people are much less formal. Some people keep some of the formality of academic writing, but it tends to be more geared towards just what is going to be the most effective way to communicate whatever I'm communicating, rather than trying to satisfy a rubric or kind of arbitrary rules, or as much predefined structure. So you tend to take a lot of lessons from, psychology and studies that have been done from the past to learn how to do things like integrate social proof, which includes things like client logos and testimonials and things. Those are powerful elements. Or how to create urgency to prompt someone to make a decision now versus later. And so you learn all these principles and how to bake them into your writing. And then within that, you kind of fall into two camps. So there's conversion copywriting, or what's sometimes called direct response copywriting, which is the very salesy, almost like writing landing pages for ads, where it's very conversion oriented in that moment, and it tries to sell people almost on the page. And then you have like content copywriting, which is the kind of long run, more what I'm familiar with these days, where we are trying to produce assets that are meant to educate, entertain, etc., and then sell off the back end of that. So they tend to be longer form, and not maybe they kind of stretch out some of those ideas and do them more slowly.
That's a great distinction. And then the third form is, many people make this mistake. They hear copywriting, they think of copy, RIGHT, which is
yes, copyright law.
like procuring copyrights on, like securing your work legally. That's not what we're talking about here, right, Austin?
Yes, correct. We're talking copywriting with a WR at the beginning of the writing portion.
Like actually writing, like after you've written something, then you want to get maybe a copyright on it so that you secure that as your intellectual property, right? That's something completely different.
Yep.
And
totally different.
So it sounds like you've done both conversion copywriting, which is helping to persuade people down a one might call a persuasion path or conversion path, meaning there's a goal that you have to make some kind of sale, whether that's just an email opt-in or whatever, or an actual sale with money changing hands. And then so you're distinguishing between that and what you're doing now, which is more content based. How did you decide to focus more on content?
I think it was somewhat just dictated by going into the channel, right? So when we're if you're taking, doing SEO, you often start with kind of keyword research and develop topics out of what you can compete on, right? Because if you think about search engines, if you're going to compete in them from a marketing standpoint, it's more about demand capture than demand generation. So you can't make people search for a thing they are not already searching for, at least not very directly, right? You could run, big, broad, brand-based advertising campaigns and maybe get people to search for your brand name, but outside of that, right, if you want something more directly controllable and you want to compete in that space, you kind of have to meet people where they're already at. And so when you look at keywords, the vast majority of them are going to fall in kind of higher level, less transactional intent buckets. So if we're looking at a number of keywords, you might have many, probably the majority are just going to be looking for some sort of information, right? We would call that informational intent. Okay, so we have to be able to provide them that information first, and then if there's something related that we want to try to sell them, or a next step we want them to take, say we want them to give us their email address in exchange for some additional value, we can pitch them that in that context once we've given them what they initially came for. Similarly, kind of the next biggest bucket of intent would be like how to or DIY, right? Where you want people are looking for a process or templates or things like that to help them achieve a particular goal. And so again, we just want to meet them where they're at, give them what they want first, and then offer them kind of a next step to keep going. And so because those types of intents, informational, DIY, and how to, people searching for tools are so common, and they probably make up 80 to 90% of all the searches. And then the additional, 10 to 20% are commercial comparison, where people want to compare and contrast different options before they make a purchasing decision, or they are straight up transactional, right? People just want to buy a particular thing. Because that's the minority of search, if you're going to go compete in search, you find yourself having to learn to produce really good kind of higher level content that addresses these other intents. And so it was more just dictated by the channel of, okay, once I decided to spend more time on organic media rather than pushing into paid media, then it just naturally flowed that I would spend a lot more time, learning how to build a great content team rather than, and the minority of our work would be very, very straight, kind of deep conversion oriented. But of course, all of it, I mean, we never want to produce anything on behalf of a brand that does not offer a reader the next logical step, whatever that is.
So it sounds like you've actually found a way to blend conversion copywriting with content so that you're presenting people with quality information that they can take and understand that matches the intent that they have when they're searching for some word or phrase, and understanding that where they are in that journey of potentially making a purchase, so that you're leading them to the next steps. You've combined these two worlds. What are some of the key insights you've gotten about how to combine information, the content, with the ability to move them to the next step, to help them decide that next step is right for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you almost verged on the answer there too. So I think there are a couple of things you do. One is you have to be able to stand out with just the information they came there for. So you end up innovating on just what makes good content to begin with, like what makes an entertaining reading experience. And that covers everything from, kind of those basics we talked about, like technical stuff, like the site has to be secure and accessible and fast and, work well on mobile devices as well as desktops. So you've got all that kind of table stake stuff, right? And then it has to be well written. It has to cite quality sources. It has to do all these other things. And then beyond that, you can start to play with formats. So can we make it more valuable by shortening the time to value or presenting data that either nobody else had or nobody else had contextualized in that way to tell a story that's interesting? Or can we just do something altogether different? Can we build an interactive tool where nobody else had, or something like that? So there's that side of just like, can you deliver the information in a more interesting, compelling, engaging way? And then coming off of that, a big miss that a lot of brands have is not kind of aligning their calls to action, as we call them. So the prompt to take the next step with both the search intent. So what was the original intent of why that person came there, right? Was it informational? Did they want how-to material? Did they want to compare, options for things they're considered buying? Like, what is the intent? But then also, how far down the funnel are they? So there's a huge difference between, let's say we're talking about something, fairly complicated, right? There's a huge difference between an informational searcher that says, what is this very complicated thing, right? And just wants that like high level introduction, where they're not very sophisticated yet, right? They aren't very far down that journey yet. And so the next step for them might be something, pretty high level, right? It's pretty unlikely you discover a topic area and then purchase a solution to help solve problems in that topic area immediately, right? You're probably going to do a lot more education of yourself before you make that sort of decision. Whereas if you're answering an informational query that the mere question tells you that they have a lot of advanced knowledge and that they're pretty deep in the weeds, your call to action there is probably very different if you're really thinking through it, because you understand, okay, this is someone who's more sophisticated. They have more background knowledge coming into this because they know to ask this question. And so we can present them with a different next step. So I think a big part of it is learning that side of like, how do we actually contextualize our calls to action for this set of readers? And many brands miss that, where you go read content that they produce online and all you see is kind of one generic call to action for whatever their monetization point or pretty close to it is, right? They're always driving to add to carts or free trials or book a demo, which is absolutely appropriate in some cases, but there are cases where it's not, right? Where that's too much of a jump. And so we want to be really thoughtful about that and present whatever actually is the next logical step for that set of readers.
So you just hit on something very interesting, because you're talking about the psychology of where people are in a decision-making process. So even if someone is listening to this and they're not into SEO, they're not looking to master SEO, but they just want to understand themselves better, or they want to understand others better that they may be selling to, because we're all in sales in some way. We're all looking to enroll people in whatever vision we have that we can help. And we're all looking to help people along their own journey and win in that process. how, like, what are some examples that you can give of keywords, phrases that people are searching for when they're not as ready for something, whereas when they are much more ready for something?
Yeah, that's a good example. So if we take let's take an example in project management, right? This is a fairly established category. So you have brands like Sauna and Monday and so on. Many of us that are even vaguely in the like B2B sort of world see advertisements for these companies and are aware of them, even if we haven't used the individual software platforms, right? So you could have someone that's searching something pretty high level there, right? Like, what is a project management system? What makes a good project management system? Um, or something even like slightly deeper than that, right? Like, what is a Kanban board, which is a way of organizing that information. Those are all pretty high level, right? Where, okay, this person clearly hasn't done much research up to this point on this category. They're not asking a very detailed question about, like, which project management platforms integrate with this particular other software. That'd be a much more detailed question. Or what is the best project management system for small teams, right? That's a more nuanced search where it's clear maybe I have some purchasing intent, right? So those two types of queries you'd want to answer very differently, right? The kind of, what makes a good project management system, or what is it, you can give a high level primer, and then maybe you offer them like a downloadable guide on how to think through that decision, right, of selecting a good project management platform, rather than pushing them to make that decision right now. Whereas if they've already searched for the best project management system for small teams, if you are one of those options, your job is more to persuade them of who are you right for and who's the competition right for, and why should they, try to prompt them to actually make that decision then, or at least get deeper into their investigation by, say, signing up for a trial or a demo. So that's one example where you can see at the high level, maybe we're just offering them more information in exchange for essentially permission to continue marketing to them, which is why brands ask for your email address, right? They want to continue, they want to stay in touch. So they're going to offer you some value for that. Whereas further down, if you've already done a lot of the investigation, they may prompt you to make more of a serious, commitment to either purchase something or to kind of try it out, or see more about it.
You mentioned a very key word in that reply, which was brand. And that's something I happen to know you're very good at because I've worked with you on that. So, content is one pillar of what you do, and it's something you're known for. And SEO, which is helping that content get seen at the top of search engines when someone's searching for something relevant that matches up with that content, or more appropriately, you're matching the content with what people are searching for. That said, you're also really good at overall brand building, including choosing a color palette for how to represent a brand, choosing a design, an overall, like, I don't know what the right words are, but motif is what word that's coming to mind. How do you present your brand visually in various contexts, whether it's on the web or on a business card or in on a mobile device, etc. How do you do that? Overall, how do you think of, like, what is branding to you? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's interesting. So branding is a combination, I would think, of brand identity, which is kind of all the stuff you were talking about, right? So there's developing your logo and your UX patterns for your website, and your high level messaging and your high level kind of personas of who you're going after, and then all the way down to things like typography and color palette, and all these kind of elements that make up the core identity of the brand, right? And then you go deploy that across all these marketing assets. But then as you do that, it's about maintaining consistency throughout that. So, you establish, say, a brand voice, right? We speak this way to our customers. We assume this prior knowledge, or we don't. We use industry jargon, or we don't. We speak more formally, or we speak more casually, right? And you kind of build this almost personality to the brand as you produce all this content and all these marketing assets, and that happens across channels, right? And this is part of why, even though I talk a lot about SEO, I'm like, really, I'm a content marketer. A lot of that is focused on SEO. But, to be a good content marketer, you have to pull in all these elements that may not be directly tied to search, right? You also need onboarding guides to things, right? Or like some way to actually get people engaged with the product so they don't churn. You might need technical documentation. You might need assets that are meant to live on social media and not rank in search, or things that are only helpful to existing customers and not at all helpful to bring new customers in, right? So you take this broader view of kind of building a brand using content, and you find that, okay, nailing that brand identity and then deploying it consistently across all of this is very important, so that people come to know, like, and trust the brand as an entity. But then also you don't lose people. A big mistake in marketing is if you have people that expect one thing, and then as part of that process it becomes disjointed and jarring, and they kind of get uncomfortable with it. So a good common example of this would be like if someone sees ad copy, right? They see, a headline, a description, some imagery, and then they click on that. The page they land on needs to very quickly fulfill on that and have a lot of continuity with what I just saw, right? So it's very helpful if the landing page has similar or the same imagery, similar or the same headline, and then expounds on that, delivers on that promise. Whereas if it seems very different, I may think I accidentally got routed to the wrong website and just leave immediately, especially if I don't have that much of an existing relationship with that brand. And then there's just a lot of intangible benefits to getting this right too. I mean, everybody takes you more seriously when you've built a strong brand, even if it's fairly early, from investors to prospective customers to even something as simple as when we're doing link building outreach to publishers. We found that the nicer the brand, the better they've executed their brand identity and building nice brand materials, the more seriously they're taken when we do outreach on their behalf to even get featured by publishers. So it's one of these things that's very hard to measure, but like investing in creating a strong, on point, cohesive brand and then developing that over time is a major competitive advantage in the long run.
So it's really clear that you are much more than a content marketer. You know the visual elements, you know how to put them together, you know about how people are thinking and what they really need to help them feel comfortable to move to the next step. What is driving that passion for you that gets you up in the morning and is having you think holistically about a client's brand, everything about how they represent themselves, and then your content, because you're often helping with more than just the content. And so what is it that is your core passion that has driven you to study all these elements of what a brand is and to help clients put them together?
Yeah, that's the fun question. For me, it drives out of an overarching interest in figuring out like what makes people tick and how people make decisions. And so out of that kind of flows all this, and I also just like producing media, right? Like I started dabbling in digital photography and Photoshop when I was super young, like 11, 12 years old. And I was already good at writing, just kind of naturally predisposed to it. So learning to communicate via those mediums, then becoming fascinated with the internet as a kid, kind of sort of drove me towards this permutation of it. But I think I just as easily could have ended up, as an economist trying to study these trends in an academic sense or something like that. Or I think we share a mutual love of like behavioral economists, because they tie together these principles of psychology with kind of studying what really happens in the world and trying to understand how do people actually make decisions. And I feel like as kind of data-driven marketers, we get to almost do that in a less academic sense, but very in the weeds, very on the ground with, real people's lives and jobs at stake, not life or death, right? But people's careers, the trajectory of what happens with these companies relies on our ability to read that signal well and respond accordingly and have a good kind of baseline understanding of how people operate and how they're making decisions. And so I don't know, it's so easy for me to be passionate about the on the ground execution of these things because I'm so interested in learning what that says about people and how they live, how they make decisions, what sort of biases they're coming in with, what it takes to overcome their objections, all these sorts of things. And those have really wide reaching impacts, right? You look at even, I know we've talked before about how, people's beliefs about things can affect like giant geopolitical outcomes and shape the entire world. So there's like no limit, this affects everything from which brand of paper towels you buy at the store to whether a war happens or not. And so I find it immensely interesting at all levels.
And for people that don't know, Austin and I have spent many, many hours talking about behavioral economics and decision making and regular economics and how the world works and just all kinds of things about. We like connecting the dots between things. Decision making.
This particular podcast, you share such wide-ranging interests.
Yeah, and I think we're helping to share that with others so they can understand some of the context and how to connect the dots also between these different topics in a way that they can go and use in whatever that they're doing. Decision making is really one of those. Why is helping people make decisions, quality decisions for themselves? Why is that more important in today's world than it ever really has been before?
I think a lot of it is, just saving like opportunity cost, right? Like a lot of what I end up doing on the coaching and mentoring front is trying to shortcut people to the right answer that they absolutely could have found on their own, but with much more trial and error. And I'm coming in with a lot more context for how these channels work and what works and what doesn't even. And also like getting exposure to so many companies that I've seen a lot of, what are the pitfalls? What are the things that are hard to figure out? When is the right time to do particular things? So you could save people tons of time and money, pursuing the wrong thing, right? Like you could easily spend a year or two very invested in doing the wrong thing and find that in some cases that totally decides whether a company makes it or not, right? Whether it can sustain these efforts long enough to see them become fruitful. But also you can just save people a lot of mental headache and anguish. We live in a world where we have such an abundance of information, right? The internet is growing faster than ever. Google's even struggling to keep up with indexing it all at this point, right? So that we're awash in information, but separating the signal from the noise, I think, is becoming increasingly harder, and maybe even more so now that AI can help us regurgitate the things we already know even more so. And so anybody who can kind of offer that signal, right, and shortcut people to the right things to be focused on such that they can kind of move on with their life in a way, or at least not make big mistakes that are going to take them off the wrong direction. I think that's a valuable thing no matter the context.
Is there anything else from the science that's being called behavioral economics or anything like that you think would be valuable for other people to know because it could help them in whatever they're doing?
Oh, there are so many things. I think one of the things is to try to become aware of your own cultural biases. So one, I can't remember which book this came from, but there was an example of a particular airline that basically the co-pilots had noticed an issue with the de-icing of a particular plane, but because the both of the pilots came from the same culture, can't remember exactly which country it was. I want to say it was maybe Japan, but I'm not sure. But it's a very deferential culture where, based off seniority, you would be very deferential to anyone who was above you in kind of the management hierarchy or just societally, right? And so they found that the co-pilot kind of nudged them, right? Like, are you sure about this issue? Have you double checked this thing? But would not directly say what they knew to be true, which is there is a major issue with this thing and you need to stop what you are doing. And so one of the ways that particular airline solved for that is they made all their pilots speak in English, and that helped overcome the cultural barrier, which was perhaps an unusual solution, but apparently it worked to some degree just to change, get out of kind of that inbuilt context they had of we're speaking our native tongue, we're kind of conforming to the cultural expectations of where we are from, to we are in a different scenario. There are different cultural expectations here. And one of them is you must speak up if you notice something like that, even to the point of upsetting your superiors, right? And so that's one example, but we all have things like that where we're saying not aware of our own cultural biases, but if we practice being analytical enough about it, sometimes we can become at least somewhat aware of them, and try to mitigate those in our own lives. So I don't know that that's too prescriptive, but it's a lens to think about.
That's a great story, and I've heard that story. So thanks for reminding me. I think it's a great one for everyone to hear. Um, and that story is interesting because it's touching upon a struggle that company had, and it was a cultural, not just a culture within the company, but also within Japanese culture.
Hmm.
And especially in marketing, we have struggles. It's not an easy profession, right? No matter what part of marketing you're in, whether it's SEO or overall branding or graphic design or analytics or whatever it is you're doing, it's tough. What's a time you can remember where you felt like you hit a plateau and you just were not sure how to get to the next level? Because someone who is highly interested in mastery, like you, always wants to get to that next level. What did you do at that time that could be helpful for other people to know about?
Yeah, there have been several. One example is I mentioned earlier that early on in my career, I was a copywriter, and for a time, I kind of made a go of that as my full time gig. And then it got a bit rocky after a while, and I was kind of looking at, okay, why is this not going as well as it had been? Like, what's the shortcomings here? And I came to the conclusion that I just wasn't that good at selling, at least in person. I could do it okay on the page, although I would say by my standards today, I wasn't that great at it on the page, but I was okay at that, right? But in the room on a call, not very great at it at that point. And so in that case, what I did is just say I have to. In some cases, you really just need to get the reps in. You just need to do it a whole bunch and trust that you'll figure it out on the way. And so that's exactly what I did in that case by cold emailing my way into that sales gig, and very quickly within a couple of weeks finding myself without much training just on a lot of sales calls and having to figure it out and push people towards signing deals that at the time were for dollar amounts I was very uncomfortable with, and get over my own scarcity bias there with the background I had, and learn that basically it was an ROI calculation, right? If this was feasible and it was reasonably you know uh, sound as an investment, then that wasn't the craziest thing to ask somebody for. And then I learned about consultative sales and how to do it without feeling bad about myself, because I knew I was going to genuinely just present them the best option, whether that was working with us or not doing that. And that made me much more comfortable with it. And then I also just got the reps in, right? Got to be on eventually like 20 hours a week I was spending on the phone just doing sales work at that point in my life. And so I got good at it, right? Just from saying, okay, I am deeply uncomfortable with this. This causes me all sorts of anxiety. Nonetheless, the only way I'm going to solve this is to put myself in a scenario where I am forced, not of my own accord. I'm not going to have to make the decision over and over. I'm going to, kind of burn the boats, as it were. And all I have to do is, do the reps, get that practice in, and then just trust that, if you're being analytical about it and you're trying to study what works, what doesn't, and you are doing something on a regular basis, it's almost impossible not to get better past a certain point, because so many people just don't actually put the reps in, right? They don't put themselves in a scenario where they're going to get deliberate practice over and over and over and over and over.
Speaking of getting the reps in, what does your daily routine look like nowadays? You can tell us anything, or you can, I don't want to get too personal, but the more you're willing to share, the better, because oftentimes I find that what we do from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed, whether it's what we consider at work or we consider health routines or whatever, that's really helpful to know. But whatever you're willing to share.
Yeah, I mean, I run kind of an unusual schedule, but if I were to average out the most common day, I tend to, I'm a bit of a night owl, so I also wake up later than most people. So I'm probably up at about 10 a.m., which is very late for some people. And I'm trying to get to work by 11. So I just run through regular morning routine, get ready for the day, get dressed, get some coffee, see if there's anything urgent that has hit my inbox that I need to tend to fairly early. From there, I tend to be mostly focused on meetings for the first half of the day. So kind of the normal working hours portion of the day. So from like 11 a.m. to 5 or 6 p.m., I'm mostly focused on what meetings do I have. And so that's a mix of like client update meetings, which are kind of strategy focused, mentoring calls, which, I do a lot of, coaching workshops, or organizational strategy calls related to coaching, or like internal team calls, and then a sprinkling of other things, right? Uh, Interviews on either side. I could be interviewing subject matter experts or doing an interview. Um, Random ad hoc calls that clients ask for to touch on a particular strategy point, things like that, right? So that first half of the day tends to be just dictated by the calendar, right? Like, where do I need to be? What do I need to prepare for to show up and be the consultant and the strategist people expect me to be? And then I often kind of step away from work for a while. So that's when I go get outside before the sun goes down, socialize a bit, get some exercise, like decompress from work a little bit. But then the odd thing is, and I am in a, I guess, tremendously privileged position to both be a remote worker who has a highly flexible schedule, and also to, at this point in my life, I do not have like children to worry about, so I can run my schedule however I want. And so late at night, I will work what I call second shift, which is when I do all the individual contributor or planning or strategy work I need to do that I just didn't have time for in the regular day because I was too busy showing up to meetings and making sure I'm ready for those. So that's when I do things like write new SOPs or prepare new presentations or work on a strategy deliverable for a particular campaign or build web pages or respond to, give design feedback I need to give or strategy feedback I need to give on assets the team is producing. And so it's kind of a two-phase schedule, but I think that works for someone like me that's trying to blend kind of the maker and manager roles or the individual contributor and manager roles where you need to show up in one way at a certain point in time and another way at another point in time, and both of those need to occur for the whole thing to go well.
So you're in meetings quite a bit, and one thing I want to touch on here is introversion versus extroversion. Which do you, and it's really a spectrum, which do you consider yourself more of?
I'm definitely more extroverted, though in a very odd way. So I find it very energizing, and yet I still experience social anxiety on the front end. But once I'm in and I'm like achieve that flow state, I'm never happier than when I'm deep in conversation with multiple other people. But getting into it can still be a little rough, even for someone that on like assessments I score like off the charts extroverted, and yet still sometimes a bit difficult to get into that flow.
That's funny because I've often scored 100% introvert on assessments, and that's, of course, these are assessments. You just never, they're not perfect, but
yeah.
In your case, being more extroverted, once you're in your flow in a meeting, you're actually energized by that. Like after the meetings or after your day of meetings, do you actually feel more energized by the fact that you've been in meetings?
I mean, as long as they were positive, productive. I mean, certainly you occasionally have meetings that are, more confrontational or things aren't going so well or things don't get received as well as you would liked, and that's not great. But you roll with the punches. But more often than not, right, most of the meetings I'm on are, positive, collaborative, even if we're having to say course correct something that isn't working, quite so well, as long as everybody's coming at it with good faith and everybody trusts each other, then I still find those very positive interactions to have. So yeah, absolutely. And same thing with like even mentoring calls and such, right? Even if I'm rehashing something that's to me nothing novel, getting to help somebody or unlock a new insight for them or anything like that is very rewarding. And I often come away with it with at least the feeling of more energy rather than less. I guess, who knows?
So that energy helps to fuel and propel your second shift, as you called it.
Absolutely.
And how does that constantly sharing information, whether in meetings with clients or in mentor calls, how does that help you to continue building your mastery, to share that information?
Quite a few ways. I mean, one is, and I'm far from the first person to point this out, but you have to learn something better to teach it than you have to learn it to merely execute it. And so it ends up clarifying your thinking and forcing you to crystallize it in your own mind as you get better at explaining it, right? So even for things that are very established, I find I know them a lot better now that I've had to explain them to a bunch of people than I did when I first kind of comprehended them myself. Similarly, you get asked a lot of questions that you hadn't thought of before. So it's very much not uncommon for me to get asked something that is such an edge case that I don't immediately know the answer, but I sure as hell know a faster way to find it out than whoever's asking me, right? Like I know where to look, or I know how to test that, or something like that. And so I can arrive at those answers and end up knowing something I wouldn't have known because I wouldn't have thought to ask it because someone asked me and because I was expected to be that person that can go find that out, and indeed was, right? So that becomes really valuable. And just getting exposure to other types of business models I find really interesting. That's been one of the cool things with doing so much mentoring is you get so much exposure to so many businesses so fast. And I would say this is true even of agency work as well, right? Because you're working across multiple companies, not just in one. That it's almost like speed running your career in a way, where you get a lot of exposure to a lot of things really quickly, but then you also see just how different sectors of the economy work and how different types of businesses are structured and what do they really care about and what are their challenges. And sometimes they aren't what you expect, but you see enough of those and I feel like you kind of build these rough kind of lattices or frameworks in your mind such that you can understand the next one a little faster because you have a larger sample set of kind of like how do these things generally work to pull from. And then when you get exposed to new businesses, you can kind of guess the angles or what's important to them, or how it functions more easily, and be wrong less of the time, which actually allows you to ask more pointed specific questions and kind of get to the chase more quickly when you talk to those people, which is tremendously useful.
So true. That's been my experience too. It's just amazing the variety and the questions you had that you didn't expect. And as long as you're willing to be a little uncomfortable and work through things and go back and learn new things, it's great. You were the one who introduced me to GrowthMentor, and that's one of the key communities that you and I both mentor in. How did you find GrowthMentor? How did you find other communities where that were maybe more SEO specific that helped you find peers and mentors?
Yeah, it's always been different places. I think I usually kind of initially hear about things through word of mouth. That was certainly the case with Growth Mentor. Is they did a really good launch at the time when they were a very new brand, and it was kind of all the buzz in my sphere of Twitter, back when it was still called Twitter, and so I was like, well, what is this this thing people are talking about, this Growth Mentor? And so I went to check it out, and I was familiar with things that were somewhat similar from other brands, but they had a different take on it, being marketers only, and kind of focused a little more on early stage and growth startup kind of stages of it. And so I found that interesting, and I had the background where I thought there's a decent chance they'll let me into this as a mentor. So let me kind of fill out the application, throw in all my social proof elements of stuff I've done in the past, and I'd done some things, been on podcasts and written for Copy Blogger and things like that. So I'd some credentials to kind of get me in the door, and I just started doing it right very early on. People didn't have as much experience on the platform, and so I was able to kind of hit the ground running and basically just didn't say no to almost any session if I felt like I could help them. I would tell somebody if it's a little outside of my area of expertise, but still just put in forth a good faith effort and try to help them there. And then other communities, I don't know, I feel like it's always been word of mouth. Like Traffic Think Tank is a big one in the SEO space that I recommend. I feel like I just heard about that from a few other people that were already in it, and that's not that uncommon, right? Often you develop peers along the way, and then you'll just hear people mention groups. Like I know you're big in ClickMakers, which is a good PPC group, and so you hear about these kind of communities that you want to be a part of. I came up in the copywriter clubs, masterminds, and such early on, so a lot of it's just networking as you go along, and you know about a couple of things at one point in time, and you meet people there that tell you about other things, and suddenly you have this much broader awareness of kind of what's available, and you pick from that what you're interested in. So I don't know, maybe not something for people to stress too much about. It just kind of happens. You discover these communities along the way.
You've been very intentional about your networking, though, and it sounds like many of the opportunities that you've talked about they kind of arise from meeting people and just not knowing where it's going to go. But you meet many people, and then amazing that things happen. Do you have any tips on how people can more intentionally network amidst all the craziness, all the chaos of a given workday, and just the busyness, right? The busyness of business.
Yeah.
How do you intentionally network?
I don't know that I'm as well. Maybe I'm intentional, but I'm not at all calculated, I guess. And so I don't have a super defined framework for how I go about this. I try to increase the velocity of conversations that I have to a pretty high point, or at least what I can stand. So I want to talk to a lot of people. I want to get exposure to a lot of companies. I want to just try to help a lot of people and not have anything in particular that I'm driving towards, at least the vast majority of the time. Obviously, if someone came in as like a sales lead, I'm going to try to sell them if I think that's appropriate to do so. Um, but which is not always, right? Sometimes I tell people this is a bad investment for you right now. You should either pursue this channel later and go do these things first, or you should actually, this is just not a good idea for you at all. I think you should go do this other thing. So there are those cases. But if you have a lot of those conversations, and I think you end up just kind of naturally finding the people you resonate with, right? Like you and I initially just worked on the same project, but we got along really well. You were my direct point of contact there, and found ourselves talking more, and then we became friends. And that sort of thing has happened for me multiple times, where it's not like I sought this person out trying to make a connection or was trying to do business with them directly or what have you, but just by happenstance we met and we happen to resonate, and then you just make a point of continuing to talk to those people. I find most people are kind of, if you're genuinely thoughtful about it, and you're not trying to get anything out of them, they can feel that lack of being transactional in the relationship. Most people are pretty open, and so from there it's just making sure you, at least at somewhat regular intervals, keep in touch with them so that those relationships don't fall off. But yeah, I think a lot of us just have a lot of conversations, and you'll figure out who you resonate with. And so if you can put yourself in that sort of position where you are just talking to as many people as possible and trying to be helpful in whatever way you can, whether that's direct advice or actually work or connecting them with other people that they might find useful, that happens a lot too. Then all those things will lead to you just having a stronger and stronger network over time without you having to kind of go into a conference with your business cards in hand and a game plan for the people you want to meet. I don't think you ever have to be that calculated about it. Just be friendly, talk to a lot of people, figure out who you like, and try to add value to them, and it will come back to you in myriad ways that you cannot predict and should not expect, but it will just happen.
You mentioned that like you and I have gotten much deeper over time. We just started working together, and we just get on calls now and we talk about all kinds of stuff. You find that just naturally happens, where you and I actually have structure. Like we actually have meetings on the calendar where we know we're just going to meet and talk on a regular basis. Are you doing that with other people too, to stay in regular touch with people that you want to go more in depth with, or do you mostly let that happen naturally and hope that you do have deeper conversations with people you want to go deeper with?
I do that in some cases and not in others. So yeah, there are certainly other cases. For instance, I just had a call the other day with we call it the Warren, but it is a collection of a few of us that were in a more formal mastermind group for years. And then eventually that group dissolved, but a few of us decided we want to stay in touch. And so just once a quarter, we just have a call on the calendar, and it gets moved around every now and then, right? But we have years of history. We know the context of where each other are coming from. Everybody trusts each other, and it's still good to have that occasional touch point, even if most of it is just catching up on each other's lives, and there's not as much kind of tactical talk these days, but certainly there can be, right? We all know each other's areas of expertise, and that keeps the social bond strong, such that if anybody in that group I know, oh, actually they're really good at that, let me ask them. It's not like, hey, I haven't talked to you in 4 years. Like it's a much easier conversation to have, just very informally, like, hey, can I ask you about this, or can I get some time on your calendar to talk about this, what have you. So that sort of thing happens a lot. And then you do have those softer connections where it floats in and out. So people that you reconnect with at different points, and sometimes if the relationship was good, that feels very natural, and sometimes there's a little bit of warming it back up and people remembering the context, and so that happens. And then some people you already have an occasion to stay in touch with, right? So I think you and I, we didn't set up that recurring meeting until we no longer had a recurring meeting for kind of more direct work purposes, right? And so often you kind of have some sort of occasion on the front end to be running into these people or chatting with them regularly, and then that becomes a more deliberate decision later on, when that kind of initial excuse for being around each other goes away. I think of it almost akin to like when people make friends in college, right? They often have a reason for socialization on the front end of, oh, we just have a class together and we ended up talking. And then at some point that has to become deliberate of, now I am choosing to stay in touch with this person. And that can happen in ways as soft as just adding them as a connection on LinkedIn to, something more like, oh, we're going to actually work on a side project together or make sure we have a recurring call on the calendar, and anywhere in between, perfectly acceptable. Again, just kind of see how it shakes out, but that's how I think about it.
So you're doing that with other people too, where you have some things on the calendar, and in other cases you're just kind of organically keeping in touch. What would you be more calculated about? If I sound like Chandler from Friends, what would you want to be? What would you want to do better to build your mastery? If anything and everything that you would want to do better to build more mastery in what you're doing with SEO, content, branding, all of that.
Oh man, that's a good question. Certainly in the networking front, I would actually like to be better at following up with people that I don't have a regular occasion to stay in touch with. So that's something I'm going to be potentially developing some sort of like reminder system for myself at some point of like, hey, you haven't talked to so-and-so in 6 months. You probably should. You all get along pretty well. They're a smart person. just see what's up. But I'm kind of notoriously bad about that. Beyond that, I would say my kind of current subtopic of most interest within my professional work is I'm trying to really figure out programmatic SEO at the moment. Quick definition for anyone who's not familiar: programmatic SEO is when you have like thousands to as many as millions of pages that you need to spin out for to address very pattern-based queries, right? So you can imagine if you have best color shoe type for niche, right? That could be best blue running shoes for women. That could be best brown hiking shoes for kids, right? And you can imagine a million different permutations of that. So if you're an e-commerce site like Zappos, you have to learn how to spin out a bunch of web pages that correctly address all of those individual queries. And so you often want to minimize the amount of deliberate human effort copywriting work that goes into each of those because you need so many of them. And so you have to think about, how do I build a structure where I can make that as efficient as possible? So can I pipe in data from APIs and scraping, and can I make the information that's on this page very pattern based and then feed in data points to decide exactly what it says? And so that's a rabbit hole I'm jumping down right now, is figuring out the practical side of how to actually implement that and launch that as projects. I've done a little bit of that before, but I want to get really good at that. Beyond that, we're pushing into more interactive content. So I think the web is going to become more interactive over the next few years. So we've started doing things like interactive maps and data visualizations, quizzes and calculators, things like that. So I'm trying to push that front as new tools become available, and teach the team how to do that and kind of disseminate that information. Those are some of the major areas of focus. So there's always something new, right? Like there's always a new subtopic or a way you could make your work just that much better, that much more compelling, that much more differentiated, so that it's easier to sell, and also actually converts better.
Wow. And so when you're learning, especially complex topics like programmatic SEO, how do you go about that learning? What is your learning style? How do you go about learning that as quickly and effectively as possible?
Yeah, so it helps to kind of have you have your existing kind of prior lattice of knowledge of everything you piece together up to that point, right? So it helps that I understand the topic at a high level, and I know to some degree I know what I don't know, and so it can be harder if you don't, right? When you're first approaching a topic where you don't quite have your head around all the different you don't have a wide ranging model for how it all works. And so in this case, I'm kind of subtopic oriented. I do know that. One of the first things I'll do is try to figure out where are the quality sources of who already knows about this and has taught on it publicly and is well regarded by other people I respect. And so that's certainly something I did here is I went and kind of gave myself a crash course of like asking around and searching in masterminds and figure out like where are the best resources, what discussions are already being had here, and trying to get myself up to speed very quickly. And I also wanted to get a sense of what tech was involved. So I started to research, different database platforms and how those connect with different content management systems like WordPress, Shopify, Webflow. Those are content management systems, the back ends of websites. And then you have the databases that hold all the information. And then you have the side of kind of the information collection is probably the next thing I need to figure out. So how do you wire that into APIs and scraping and all that? So I think it's in some sense you need to kind of get your head around what all the elements are, and then what's involved in the different pieces that connect it. How does a thing go from one part of a process to the next, or one part of a complex system to the next? And then you can kind of individually dive in and fill in your gaps for each of those, and then come back out. And at some point, you've got to find a way to just implement it. So that will be the next step probably for me. Is I've done programmatic projects in the past where I was advising on certain portions, like, okay, here's the page layout we're going to use and the baseline copy, and here's how that's going to map to the database. I've never done the whole thing soup to nuts where we controlled the database and how the information got in there. And so I'm probably going to run a side project or two to get that kind of hands-on experience and learn a lot of the trial and error lessons, because theory will only get you so far to make an odd Oppenheimer reference there.
Do you want to expand on that Oppenheimer reference? Just kidding. You mentioned existing lattice of knowledge, and that's so true. Like if you know something about the topic, you have a base of knowledge, like you said, lattice of knowledge, and you're able to add to that. That's really helpful. And then you're doing some small projects to give you some experience, and then you can do bigger projects as you get more comfortable. What do you do when you're going into something totally new? And this is where we can start talking about your side interests that you mentioned, you alluded to at the very beginning. You just got interested in guitar. You got interested in cooking. I know you're a connoisseur of bourbon. There's a number of things you're interested in.
Yep.
And at some point you were new at those and you said, I'm going to start learning about this. How do you go about that learning?
Yeah. So I find that there's got to be something to get, there's like the initial spark of like, ooh, I really like this thing. And like, I want to know more about this. Right. So that could be me watching the solo for November Rain by Guns N' Roses be played when I was 10 years old. And I was like, guitar is cool. I want to know that. Or trying Four Roses single barrel for the first time and being like, this whiskey stuff's pretty good. I'd like to know a thing or two about that. Or trying Eggs Benedict as an adult and being like, I'd like to know how to cook that. And that seems fairly complex. So I'm going to need to pick up some skills to figure that out. So there's kind of that initial flash of inspiration, right? Of just, oh, this is cool. I want to know more about this. And then you can either kind of enter into it narrowly. So try to figure out like that exact thing, right? If I had tried to start learning that exact guitar solo, that would have crashed and burned. But in other cases, if you have baseline cooking skills, you can probably learn a complex recipe. It might just take you a little longer. So it depends. You can either kind of go into it narrowly and try to figure out that exact thing and expand out from there. Or it's more like the approach I take now, more deliberately in the professional realm where, okay, I want to figure out what all is here, right? I want to kind of be able to wrap my head around or wrap my arms around what all this subject area is made out of. Like, what are the major categories of knowledge here, differentiation, what makes a good X, like how do you distinguish between good and bad here, or skilled and unskilled, like what is the difference even? And you develop your taste that way. So I find that taste precedes skill, right? You get good at recognizing a good thing from a bad thing, or an excellent thing from a good thing, way before you actually know how to produce the excellent thing. And so refining your taste such that you can recognize great work and start to like analyze the elements that actually distinguish it is another part there. And then at some point you have to find out who the real kind of, not necessarily the best experts, but the best experts who teach are, right? So I think someone can be very well versed in their field and be absolutely horrible at explaining it to anyone who isn't that way. But if you can find the people who can convey that knowledge really well, you can kind of speed run the best of educational resources that are out there. And if you combine that with good taste, you can usually get to sort of an intermediate, better than most level pretty quickly. And then you can decide from that vantage, like whether you care enough to actually go advanced, or whether actually just being better than most and kind of having intermediate knowledge in this topic area is good enough, and that's all you ever really wanted. And for each of us, we'll have different areas where we get so far and decide that's good enough, and some areas where we're like, no, I still have so much passion for this, and I want to learn every little nuance, and I want to keep digging, keep pushing here, and actually, try to become somewhat an expert, even if you wouldn't maybe brand yourself that way.
How early in the process do you seek out teachers? I mean, I guess at first you look at YouTube and kind of explore a little bit on your own, or do you immediately seek out a teacher?
It depends on how you define teachers, right? Because I would think those are teachers, but maybe you mean like more hands-on.
Yeah, it wasn't a great question. I mean, because people on YouTube are teaching. Do you seek out someone, like, do you seek out a course pretty early on in the journey, or like a mentor early on in the journey, or are you comfortable with videos at first and then doing a lot of experimenting on your own?
I'm usually pretty comfortable kind of self-educating until the point where I get stuck. So I would tend to think that I can learn a thing just based off resources more times than not, and then kind of wait to get stuck and then seek out like personalized help only when I'm actually stuck. So I kind of want to see how far I can get, I guess, more times than not. In some cases that's very far, in some cases that's not very far at all. And that presumes that this is very foreign to me. So if I already personally know someone that's quite good at that, I will go seek their help much earlier, and I will kind of ask for them to some degree curate where I should be looking, because I know I can do that for people too, where amongst the things I know pretty well, I can sort the wheat from the chaff really quickly and be like, okay, you're at this level, just go look at these 4 things and that will start you off in the right direction. So if I already know someone who's in that kind of slot in my mind, I'll go ask them for recommendations. But if not, I'll kind of do my own research and search online and Google and YouTube. And if I know where the communities are, maybe I'll go search in communities as well. So those could be, Facebook groups or subreddits or private Slack groups if they cover that topic and I'm in them, and go look for where do they point and what resources do they reference frequently, and use that as a jumping off point. But I tend to kind of go that route until I get stuck and then be like, all right, who could help me get unstuck? And that's when I would seek out kind of direct mentorship or coaching or teaching or whatever you want to call it.
So pick one of those topics that you mentioned that you are working on mastering. You've been working on mastering this for years, and how did that go? Pick anything.
Oh man, which one to pick? The media production one's kind of interesting, I guess. Media production. How did I first get into that?
And before you get into that, what is media production?
And that's part of the trick, is that I'm defining it so broadly, right? So I think of media production as encompassing the written word, right? So blogs, articles, white papers, ebooks, anything in that realm. And then like visual communication, so photographs, video, charts and graphs. I'm kind of thinking everything within that realm is media production. Then also like producing web pages, I would also consider media production, right? So anything you're producing that will live on its own and communicate as a standalone asset, something, is, I guess, media broadly. Perhaps that's such a broad definition that it's not terribly useful, but
all good. And that's more in the professional realm that we were talking about before. On the personal side of things, like guitar, cooking, photography, any number of things. I pick one of those personal interests, and let's talk about how you went about that journey over the last few years.
Okay. Yeah, maybe kind of the cocktails realm would be kind of interesting. That's a very active one for me.
Okay. So just so everyone knows, I'm a non-drinker, and Austin is constantly trying to explain various nuances of of alcoholic drinks, which are fascinating because there's so much production involved. It's really an art and a science, right? So
yes,
please continue. Just so everyone knows, I really don't know. And if you don't know, if you're listening to this, it's totally fine. You'll probably learn something about the journey of mastery anyways.
Yeah, there's still, it's still an interesting industry and, I don't know, interesting subset of hospitality, I guess, even if you don't partake. And now actually there's this whole realm of mocktails kind of taking some of the same lessons, but without booze actually being in them. And so, some degree, even if you're not a drinker these days, you can still appreciate some of the exact same things of the layering and flavor combinations and such. But yeah, it's interesting. Getting into that, kind of an odd journey. I guess like most people, when I first started drinking, I was not drinking for the complex nuances of spirits or the things mixed into them. Right, I was drinking for effect rather than for enjoyment, as it were. But nonetheless, slowly started to graduate out of that, right? As you discover, I mean, people do mix drinks even on like college campuses. People are mixed together what are called highballs. They don't know that, but that is mixing like soda in with a base spirit. And so you learn what do you like among that. Get a little fancier, and we started making Cuba Libres, which are rum and cokes with lime in them, right? So just getting ever so slightly more sophisticated, right? And then I discovered at some point, as I mentioned, I got started to get exposed to kind of higher shelf liquor, right? I tried single barrel bourbon for the first time, and I was like, ooh, this is interesting. This doesn't just burn like I was used to alcohol burning. It was like, no, right after that, when it stops burning your tongue, you can taste all these nuances. It tastes like there's so much stuff in this. It could taste like, leather and caramel and tobacco and kind of these darker, richer notes, or it could taste more citrusy and floral and such. And I had already gained a little bit of that from learning a lot about coffee a little earlier and espresso. So I had some sense of like, oh, there can be complex flavors here. And then again, you have kind of, okay, there's a little bit of base level interest in here. And then I got to see it done really well, right? I got to a couple times in my earlier years get to go to really nice cocktail bars and see, wow, they're doing interesting stuff here. They are lighting things on fire and they are, mixing in ingredients I've never seen before. And I, look at a big shelf full of bottles and be like, I have no idea what 95% of this stuff is. But you slowly build it out, right? You get curious about one thing and you're like, okay, I'm going to go, this is where I took the narrow path, right? So it would be, I had one thing, I want to go learn how to make that thing. And pretty soon you realize there are patterns to this. Like certain things are built with certain combinations, and then those patterns can be executed over and over. That's something I learned with coffee, right? Almost all coffee drinks are espresso plus steamed milk plus maybe syrups. And the texture of that milk changes a lot. And that's the only difference between a latte and a cappuccino and a cortado and like all these different drinks are just how much milk and what's the texture of it. But the combination of elements is all the same. And so cocktails have patterns like that too. And so does the web, right? The way you structure landing pages has patterns to it. And so you often at some point get mature enough in your understanding of it to start recognizing the patterns. And then I find your learning speeds up quite a bit because now you can kind of see the forest for the trees, as it were. You stop with kind of the narrow learning of I'm going to learn this one thing and this one thing and this one thing, and you start to get a sense of the system in which it operates. And so I think I mentioned that before, where depends on what level of knowledge you're coming into a topic with, whether you can kind of gain systems level knowledge first and then go into specifics, or if you kind of go from inspiration to specifics and then to more systematic knowledge. I don't think there's anything wrong with either of those paths. It just depends on what's your background coming into the topic.
That's one thing that I used to teach to my students when I was teaching test prep, high school kids, and the very first session, I would say, really the only difference between me and you is And I would talk about pattern recognition. But first, I didn't say that. I would ask them, what is your definition of an expert? And they would say various things like someone who gets paid a lot, someone who knows a whole bunch of stuff, someone who's become well-known, like all these different things that they often think about when they think of an expert. I would say really an expert is just someone who has more pattern recognition in a particular area than you do right now, and therefore you consider them an expert. So I'm really just here to help you become that expert for yourself, where you have this pattern recognition. You see these test questions, you see how they're trying to trick you, you see the patterns, and then you know which path you should go down to narrow down the answer choices, or to which is the most efficient path to actually answer this question in the time that you have, right? So how do you build pattern recognition faster? How do you do that from day one? Start building pattern recognition in whatever you're learning, whether you're a coffee connoisseur or cocktails connoisseur like you, or anything else.
Yeah. I have a few thoughts there. I mean, one is look for the points of differentiation. That'll teach you a lot of things really quickly, right? So it goes back to that kind of like what makes a good X question, right? So the more you can focus on what distinguishes the good from the bad and the great from the merely good, the more you'll know about the topic area in general, right? Like once you know what people more established in kind of that area of knowledge look for, and then ask the why, right? Like, well, why I care about that thing? And often I find that you uncover a lot from that. And I could come up with many obscure examples of that, right? But yeah, you learn to ask those more specific questions and then drill into the underlying logical basis for why that's a thing to aspire to. Another thing is just having broader mental models. So like, for instance, there are a few different like broad business types that I've become very familiar with, right? So there's like service-based businesses that operate virtually, service-based businesses that operate in person, SaaS businesses that are more enterprise and operate on a very sales assisted model, software businesses where it's self-serve, where you can just sign up, right, yourself, and they're more focused on lower price points at scale, right? So you learn kind of these broad frameworks, and then the more of those you get, the more quickly you can identify when someone's doing something that's a slight twist or something that's completely different based off whether it fits the model or not. And then you can go even further out than that and think about like baseline societal level mental models, like just learning about like logical biases will make you a lot sharper, because you're like, oh, that's a straw man argument, or this is a red herring that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Why did you even bring that up? And be able to spot when people are kind of not being entirely forthcoming, or they're making an argument that's not in good faith, or they just, all sorts of things like that. And so I don't know. I think of that as being part of it too. Of that helps you weed out bad information or not waste time on the wrong things. And then if you can develop these higher level mental models and then focus on points of differentiation, probably those three things help get you there a lot faster.
That sounds like a thorough answer. You really gave us a framework for how to think about it's almost like you gave us a pattern for how to think about how to acquire patterns and start to recognize patterns. So I appreciate that multi-layered answer. How about let's pause here and we can talk some more maybe in another interview if people want. And let's transition into some of the wrap-up questions. And I did give you this in advance, so you had some time to think about it. But who's someone in history that you really admire for their mastery?
Yeah, I found this to be, I don't know, perhaps the hardest question you asked in that regard. But a few people came to mind. I often think about mastery with musicians is one answer. So I think about everything from like when you see a really tight band where they know their cues so well and they almost feel like they can read each other's minds. That's a type of mastery I really respect. So last band I saw like that was the Marias, which is kind of like a jazz pop band with heavy Latin influence. That was really interesting. I think about the same thing with like Jay-Z doing triple entendres in like 1996, when that level of complexity to rap was not yet commonplace. It is now. but that was unusual at the time, and so I really respect anyone who can push their field forward that way, and it was just really damn clever. I think about people like Hunter S. Thompson, who's like basically royalty here in Kentucky where I'm at, but he kind of invented what's called gonzo journalism, a new style of journalism where the reporters purposefully insert themselves into the story so as to capture angles that someone who is a mere outside observer may not capture. It comes at a price of some objectivity because you are now in it rather than merely observing it, but it is nonetheless really interesting. So I think of him as a true master of his craft. And then if I was going to do a third, I would also think of, we mentioned the great behavioral economists. That is such an interest for me that I really respect some of the big figures in that field, like Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, who kind of pioneered that field. I think that going from thinking about economics as everyone is purely logical and will just optimize for whatever's in their best interest to people have these weird biases and make decisions in weird ways, and we need to understand both those and how they might optimize for their logical best interest and try to figure out what they're really going to do. I feel like that has just, I don't know, that's so similar to how I think about the world, but also I don't know if it would be had I not gotten to kind of read their work so young and have that influence so much of how I see the world to this day.
Awesome. That is such a polymath answer. For people that don't know, Austin and I are these personality types called polymath, which really means that you just have such strong interest in multiple areas, and you oftentimes a hallmark of a polymath is we just enjoy connecting the dots between things that often don't seem like they would be connected. So that's a great answer, and it's great actually that you didn't pick just one person. You gave us a few to think about and how you actually see them connected as well. So that's awesome. And also, what kind of books, if you had up to 3 book recommendations for anyone who's listening to this to become more masterful at whatever it is that they want to become masterful at, what are those book recommendations?
Yeah. So I think in general, you should just read really widely on whatever you're interested in, but maybe that's the polymath or ADHD, but make it nice sort of answer. But if I were to make more specific recommendations, I think Traction by Gino Wickman's a really good book. It's actually quite popular. It introduced the what they call the entrepreneurial operating system, but it is a good, if you're specifically interested in how to run businesses and scale them and create some of that in the weeds, how does setting up management and hiring and like those sorts of things to the kind of what do you call it, like organizational strategy around how do you build businesses. I find that to be a very interesting book. To go to a completely different answer, the book Dataclysm by Christian Rudder. He was the co-founder of OkCupid before it got acquired by the Match Group, but as such had access to a ton of data on basically what people do when they think no one's watching, right? What sort of decisions they make on dating sites, and what that reveals about implicit biases and how people make those sorts of what are ultimately potentially very consequential, right? Someone you choose to build your life with, very consequential decisions. So I find that book quite interesting as well, and tons of data points that nobody else has in there. And then from there, I would go with either, I'm going to cheat here and break the 3 books rule, but either The Courage to be Disliked, which is quite popular now. That's more of a woo book recommendation than I would generally give, but it's quite good. And if you're going to become masterful at anything, I think you have to get comfortable with kind of failing in public or feeling embarrassed about your beginner status in something. And that's something that I both struggle with and try to put into practice. It always looks awkward to be a beginner, and everyone has to be a beginner to get past that phase. Or you could look at a book like Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, which is kind of definitely a classic, one of the books I've reread the most times. I think people get in that book overly fixated on the 10,000 hour rule that stemmed from that book, which is really talking about what does it take to be world class, like amongst the handful of best people in the world at a given thing. But even if you aren't quite that intense about it, right, you don't want to be in the 0.001% of chess players or what have you. Some of the core underlying principles of just what does it mean to do deliberate practice and how long does it really take to differentiate yourself? You can get to the top 1% a whole lot quicker than you can get to the top 0.001%. And so I probably bias more that direction, but still find that a very useful book as well. So 4 instead of 3, but hopefully you'll forgive me that overreach there.
I forgive you. And I love that you mentioned the courage to be disliked. I have not actually read that book, but just that topic itself, that's something that we didn't touch upon here. But imposter syndrome is a key part of that, and the journey to mastery. Not that mastery is a destination, but on the journey of mastery, and also just when you're carving your own path, which we all ultimately do, regardless of what path that is. People are bound to disagree with you, and how do you deal with that? So it's great that you gave a reference for that, for someone to go and dig deeper into that, and that's something we'll explore more on this podcast as well in future episodes. So thank you so much for all of those resources and all your insights, Austin. How can people contact you if they want to?
Yeah, if you want to get in touch with me, you could email me. I'm austin@conversionmedia.com. I answer slightly slowly, but I will get back to you. Not very active on social media. Certainly, you could find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm on GrowthMentor, as Sunny mentioned, or you can check me out at Conversion Media, or if you're looking for coaching, Ascent SEO Coaching. I'll throw all those links in the show notes for Sunny to add in there. So yeah, any of those places, I'm somewhat responsive at least.
Awesome. Thank you, Austin, for being here. And anybody else who has any feedback for Austin or for me on how to do this better, this is something that I'm on the journey of mastery towards. And Austin is constantly looking to improve the way he shares information, and that's one of the reasons why he does share information in this format and all the mentoring he does. So we're both open to feedback. And thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And Austin, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.